A quiet morning sun lit up the peaceful streets of Willow Creek, a neighborhood where everything seemed picture perfect. The grass was trimmed, mailboxes stood in neat lines, and every porch looked like it had been made for magazine covers. The one person who made sure it stayed that way was Mrs. Wilson. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her as the woman who noticed everything. If a car was parked an inch too far from the curb, she noticed. If someone's lawn had weeds, she noticed that too. And if a new face appeared in the area, she was the first to find out who they were. That morning, she stood by her window sipping coffee and saw a large moving truck pulling up to one of the nicest houses on the street. It was the blue house, at the corner, the one that had been empty for months after the previous owner moved away. Mrs. Wilson narrowed her eyes, curious. She hadn't received any email or letter from the homeowners association about new residents. "Strange," she murmured. "They didn't even inform the HOA." She stepped outside, pretending to check her mail, but really trying to get a better look. The moving truck doors opened and a tall young black man stepped out, giving instructions to the movers. He looked calm, polite, and focused as he carried boxes to the front porch. Mrs. Wilson frowned slightly. She didn't recognize him. Maybe he's renting, she thought. Or worse, maybe he's just staying here without permission. Her curiosity quickly turned into suspicion. She watched as he greeted the mail carrier with a smile and waved to a kid riding a bike. His friendly attitude didn't impress her. In her mind, rules were rules, and she believed everyone should get approval before moving into the neighborhood. Later that day, she put on her sun hat, grabbed her clipboard, and walked down the street. It wasn't long before she reached the new neighbor's driveway. The man was arranging boxes inside his garage, humming to himself. She cleared her throat loudly. "Excuse me," she said sharply. He turned around, surprised but smiling. "Hi there. Can I help you?" "I'm Mrs. Wilson," she said with pride. "Head of the Willow Creek HOA. I just wanted to know what's going on here. We didn't receive any notice about new residents." "Oh, nice to meet you," he replied kindly. "I'm David. I just moved in today. Bought the house a few weeks ago." Her eyebrows lifted. "You bought it?" She looked him up and down quickly, her expression tight. "Are you sure about that?" He chuckled softly, thinking she was joking. "Pretty sure. I have all the paperwork, if that's what you mean." "That won't be necessary," she said briskly. "I'll check with our records myself, but just so you know, there are rules around here. Trash pickup days, noise limits, yard maintenance, things we take seriously." David nodded politely. "Of course, I understand. I like keeping things neat too." Mrs. Wilson didn't smile back. "Well, welcome, I suppose," she said before walking away, making notes on her clipboard as if writing a report. David watched her leave, a little puzzled but not offended. He had moved to this neighborhood for peace and quiet, not to start conflicts, but deep down he could already tell this woman might become a problem. Over the next few days, David continued unpacking. He fixed a few things inside the house, painted one of the rooms, and even introduced himself to some of the nearby neighbors. Most of them were polite, though a few seemed cautious at first. He figured they were just shy or maybe surprised to see someone new. He tried not to read too much into it. Meanwhile, Mrs. Wilson couldn't stop thinking about him. Something about this situation bothered her. She checked the HOA files and found no notification of the property transfer. She didn't realize that the real estate agency had already sent an update to the HOA board, but she had missed it while she was away for a family event. Still, she was convinced something was off. Each morning she made a little walk around the neighborhood with her dog, though the dog seemed more interested in sniffing grass while she watched David's house from across the street. If his trash can was still outside by noon, she made a note. If delivery trucks stayed too long, she made another note. Soon she had a list of what she called minor violations. One afternoon she stopped one of the other neighbors, an older man named Mr. Harris, who lived 2 houses down. "Have you met the new resident?" she asked casually. "Yes, nice young fellow," he said. "Helped me move my garden pots the other day. Real polite." Mrs. Wilson frowned. "Polite maybe, but I'm not sure he belongs here. We have standards, you know. Mr. Harris gave her a puzzled look. He seems fine to me. She didn't respond. In her mind, she was protecting the neighborhood. After all, she told herself, if people start moving in without following the right process, it could cause chaos. That's what she believed. At least, that's what she wanted to believe. A few days later, she finally decided to confront him properly. She walked straight to his front door, clipboard in hand. David was trimming his bushes when she approached. "Mr. David," she called out, "I've been checking records, and it appears your name isn't listed as an approved resident under our HOA documents. I'm afraid I'll need to see proof of ownership." David set down his gardening shears and wiped his hands. "Sure," he said calmly. "I can get you the documents. I have them inside." She crossed her arms. "I'll need certified copies, not printed ones. It's possible those can be forged." David blinked, unsure whether to laugh or get offended. "Ma'am, I bought this house legally. Everything was handled through a licensed realtor." She didn't budge. "Until I confirm it myself, I'll be reporting this as an unauthorized occupancy." He sighed but kept his tone steady. "All right, you do what you need to do. I'll make sure you have what you need to verify it." As she left, she looked over her shoulder one last time, muttering under her breath, "We'll see about that." That night, David sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the quiet street. He thought about how strange it was to be treated like a stranger in a place he now owned. He had worked hard for this, years of saving, years of dreaming about a peaceful home. But instead of a warm welcome, he had been met with suspicion. Still, he wasn't angry. He knew that some people needed time to see the truth. He would let his actions speak for him. The next morning, he decided to do something kind for the community. He mowed the patch of shared grass by the corner, which most people usually ignored. He also helped a young mom carry groceries to her door when she dropped a bag. Slowly, more neighbors began waving at him, smiling, and even chatting for a minute or two. But Mrs. Wilson stayed distant. She kept sending little notices to his mailbox, small warnings about violations like leaving the garbage bin out too long or not trimming a bush evenly. David laughed them off at first, but he could tell she wasn't stopping anytime soon. One afternoon, a light rain began to fall and Mrs. Wilson was walking her dog again. She saw David helping a delivery driver who got stuck near the curb. He was soaked but still cheerful, lifting a box for the driver. The driver thanked him and drove away. As David turned to go inside, he noticed her standing there with her umbrella. "Evening," he said politely. She didn't return the greeting. "You know, Mr. David, this community values order. I hope you understand that." He smiled gently. "I do, Mrs. Wilson, and I plan to respect that. I just want to make this place feel like home." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see if that's possible," she said, then walked away quickly. After she left, David stood quietly for a moment, feeling the rain hit his face. He wasn't sure what more he could do to prove he belonged, but deep down, he decided not to let her ruin his peace. He had faced tougher things before. He could handle this too. As the days passed, her suspicion only grew stronger, while David's calm nature became even more visible to others. The neighborhood began to notice how he carried himself, always respectful, always willing to lend a hand. The contrast between his kindness and her bitterness was becoming clear. But Mrs. Wilson didn't see it that way. In her eyes, she was right, and everyone else just didn't see the real issue. She began planning to bring up the matter at the next HOA meeting. She was determined to prove that something about David didn't add up, and while she prepared her notes, rehearsing what she would say, she had no idea that the man she was trying to evict wasn't just another resident. He was the actual owner, not just of his house, but eventually of hers too. That twist was still far away, but it was coming, quietly building in the background of this perfect little neighborhood, waiting for the day when truth would turn everything upside down. The next morning was calm and quiet in Willow Creek. The sun had just started to rise and most of the neighbors were still getting ready for work. Birds chirped softly as David stepped out with a cup of coffee in his hand, enjoying the peace of his new home. For the first time since moving in, he felt like things were settling. The house was finally organized, the garden was looking better, and he had started to feel like he belonged there. But he had no idea that just a few houses away, Mrs. Wilson was preparing for another kind of morning. Her dining table was covered with papers, notes, and printed emails. She was wearing her reading glasses, scribbling in her small notebook, muttering to herself about community standards and proper authorization. Her husband had stopped, trying to reason with her a long time ago. He knew that once she decided something, there was no changing her mind. To her, this wasn't personal. At least that's what she told herself. She believed she was protecting the neighborhood. But deep down, there was something else, something she didn't like to admit. She didn't like being challenged. She had built her identity around being in control, around being the person everyone listened to, and this new man had disrupted that without even trying. Later that morning, she walked out with her clipboard again. She saw David talking to one of the neighbors, an elderly man named Mr. Harris, the same one she had spoken to before. They were laughing about something near the fence. David noticed her approaching and waved politely. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," he said. "How's your day going?" She didn't answer his question. Instead, she said, "I noticed your trash bins were out past the allowed time yesterday. Trash collection is at 8 in the morning and bins must be brought in by noon." David glanced at the bins. I guess I missed that. Sorry about that, won't happen again." She nodded stiffly. "And another thing, the moving truck stayed overnight for 2 days. That's against HOA policy." David nodded again, calm as ever. "It was a delay with the movers, but I'll make sure next time it's all cleared sooner." Mrs. Wilson wrote something on her clipboard. "Good," she said curtly. Then she turned and walked off without another word. Mr. Harris shook his head. "Don't take it personally," he said. "She's been like that with everyone for years. You're just her new project." David smiled faintly. "I'm starting to see that." Days passed, and Mrs. Wilson's watchful eyes seemed to follow him everywhere. She would slow down her car when driving past his house. She would stop talking whenever he joined a group conversation in the street. At first, he ignored it. But after a while, it became clear she was trying to push him out, and she wasn't even hiding it anymore. One afternoon, David received a letter in his mailbox with the HOA logo on it. Inside was a notice listing several violations. It mentioned things like yard overgrowth, trash mismanagement, and unauthorized occupancy. At the bottom, it said the HOA reserved the right to pursue legal action if he failed to comply. David sat on his porch reading it, shaking his head in disbelief. He had kept his lawn neat, his property clean, and followed every basic rule. This wasn't about the rules, and it was personal now. He walked down the street to Mrs. Wilson's house. She was in her front yard trimming flowers when she saw him coming. Her expression hardened immediately. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wilson," he said evenly. "I got your letter. I think there's been a misunderstanding." She didn't look up. "There's no misunderstanding, Mr. David. The HOA requires proper ownership confirmation. You still haven't submitted the documents." "I told you I'd be happy to show them," he said calmly. "You can check them right now if you like." She sighed dramatically as if he was wasting her time. "That won't be necessary. We'll verify it through official channels. Until then, you're under review." "Under review?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," she said. "If it turns out you don't have proper ownership, you'll need to vacate the property." David stood there for a moment, looking at her carefully. He realized nothing he said would change her mind. So he simply said, "All right, I'll wait for your results." Then he turned and walked away. That evening, a few neighbors noticed what had happened. Some felt uncomfortable with how she was treating him, but nobody spoke up. They had seen her do this before, harassing people until they either moved or gave up. But this time felt different. The new guy wasn't fighting back with anger or attitude. He stayed calm, polite, and kind. That made people curious about him, and slowly, they started to see through her behavior. The next day, as David watered his plants, a woman named Linda from across the street approached. She was a kind, middle-aged lady who always smiled. "Hi there," she said. "I heard what's been going on. I just wanted to say you don't deserve that." David smiled appreciatively. "Thank you. I guess I just have to be patient," Linda nodded. "She's been like this for years. She thinks running the HOA gives her power over people, but she doesn't realize when she's gone too far." They talked for a few minutes, and by the end of the conversation, Linda had offered to speak up for him if things escalated. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. It reminded David that not everyone in the neighborhood shared Mrs. Wilson's attitude. Over the next week, he continued living quietly, focusing on his work and helping neighbors when he could. He helped fix a loose fence for Mr. Harris, watered the plants for an elderly widow when she was out of town, and even joined a few community activities. Slowly, more people began greeting him by name, but Mrs. Wilson wasn't pleased. She noticed how the neighbors were warming up to him, and it bothered her. She started sending more letters, each one more aggressive than the last. One even threatened to fine him for damaging community harmony. That was the final straw. David decided it was time to attend the next HOA meeting. When the day came, he arrived early, dressed neatly, holding a small folder of documents. Mrs. Wilson was already there, setting up her papers and whispering to two other members. When she saw him walk in, her eyes narrowed. The meeting started with the usual updates about maintenance fees and neighborhood events. Then Mrs. Wilson cleared her throat and said, "There's another matter we need to address. Unauthorized occupancy at 214 Maple Street." Everyone turned toward David. She continued, "This individual has failed to provide proper documentation and has violated multiple community rules. As the HOA head, I recommend we begin the process of legal removal." A few murmurs filled the room. One man raised his hand. "Wait, are we sure about that? He seems like he lives there legitimately." Mrs. Wilson frowned. "We can't rely on appearances, Greg. We follow procedures." David waited until she finished, then stood up quietly. "May I speak?" he asked. The room went silent. He stepped forward and placed his folder on the table. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said calmly. "Here are my documents: the property deed, the purchase agreement, and the closing statement. I bought this house legally 3 months ago through a certified realtor." Mrs. Wilson froze. The other members leaned closer, looking at the papers. The documents were official, complete with legal seals and signatures. There was no mistake. After a moment, one of the HOA board members cleared his throat and said, "These look perfectly valid." Mrs. Wilson's voice trembled slightly as she said, There must be an error." "There's no error," another board member replied. "He's the legal owner." David stayed silent, his calm expression never changing. Inside, he felt a quiet mix of relief and sadness. He hadn't wanted to embarrass her. He just wanted to be treated fairly. The room remained silent for several seconds before Linda, sitting in the back, spoke up. "Maybe next time we should welcome new neighbors before judging them." A few people nodded. Mrs. Wilson's face turned pale, and she gathered her papers without saying another word. The meeting moved on awkwardly, but everyone could feel the shift in the room. When it ended, several neighbors came up to David to shake his hand or apologize for not speaking sooner. He smiled and thanked them, letting the tension fade. As he walked home that night, the cool air felt different, lighter somehow. He didn't feel angry or bitter. He just felt proud that he had stayed calm and patient. But deep inside, he knew this wasn't over. Mrs. Wilson wouldn't forget what happened. And even though the truth was out, she would find another way to prove herself right. He didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. What came next would turn everything upside down, not just for him, but for her too. The week after the HOA meeting felt strangely quiet in Willow Creek. The air seemed lighter, the neighbors more relaxed, and for the first time since moving in, David felt a bit of peace. The confrontation was finally behind him, or so he thought. Most of the neighbors had started greeting him warmly. Mr. Harris often stopped by to chat, and Linda brought over a plate of cookies one evening as a small gesture of kindness. The kids on the street waved to him when he drove by. It felt like the community was finally seeing him for who he really was, just another homeowner, trying to live his life quietly. But peace, as David soon learned, doesn't always last long when someone else's pride is involved. Mrs. Wilson had hardly been seen since the meeting. For several days, her blinds stayed closed. She skipped her usual morning walks and ignored calls from a few HOA members. Some thought she was embarrassed. Others assumed she was sick. But in truth, she was stewing. Not over the embarrassment of being wrong, but over the loss of control. In her mind, The situation had turned against her unfairly. She replayed that night in her head over and over, the way everyone looked at her when the documents proved David's ownership. She felt small, disrespected, and worst of all, powerless, and for someone like her that was unbearable. One afternoon, she finally stepped outside again. She saw David raking leaves in his front yard. He looked content, humming a tune under his breath. She wanted to just walk by, but something in her refused to stay silent. "Good afternoon," she said stiffly. David looked up and smiled. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wilson. How are you?" "I'm fine," she said quickly. "I hope there are no hard feelings about the meeting." "Not at all," he said honestly. "I'm just glad everything's clear now." She nodded slowly, pretending to agree. Yes, clarity is important, but her tone carried a sharp edge, and her eyes lingered on him a moment too long before she walked away. David watched her go, sensing there was still tension, but he decided to let it be. He wasn't going to waste energy on grudges. Life was too short for that. Days passed, and slowly, Mrs. Wilson returned to her routines. She started her neighborhood walks again, though her steps were faster and her greetings colder. Some neighbors noticed she seemed more irritable than usual. When a child left their bike on the sidewalk, she snapped. When someone parked a little close to her driveway, she left a note on their windshield. It was as if she was trying to remind everyone she still had authority, that she was still the one who made the rules. One morning, David noticed a small note taped to his mailbox. It wasn't signed, but he knew who it was from. It said, "Please remember HOA rules require all exterior changes to be approved before installation. Your new lights may not meet community standards." He sighed. He had simply replaced the old porch lights with newer, energy-efficient ones. Nothing fancy or out of place. Still, he didn't want to fuel the tension. He sent an email to the HOA office attaching the receipt and a photo, explaining that the lights matched the previous design. The HOA office responded the next day, confirming everything was fine and no further action was needed. But Mrs. Wilson wasn't done. She started looking for other things to criticize. She began taking pictures of his property, his garden, his driveway, even his fence, claiming they didn't meet aesthetic standards. She wrote complaint after complaint, most of which were dismissed by the HOA board. But she didn't stop. At one point, she even suggested to the HOA committee that they re-inspect all recent home purchases to ensure legitimacy. The other members refused. They were tired of her obsession. When word of this reached David, he didn't get angry. Instead, he felt sorry for her. He could see she was holding on to something she didn't know how to let go of. He wondered if she'd always been this way, or if life had just hardened her over time. A few evenings later, there was a small neighborhood gathering at the park. Families brought food, kids ran around playing, and people chatted happily. David joined in, bringing some homemade lemonade. It was a simple thing, but everyone appreciated his effort. Mrs. Wilson showed up too, though she mostly stood off to the side. When she saw how everyone was laughing and talking with David, her chest tightened with irritation. The same people who once praised her for her strictness were now gravitating toward the man she had tried to remove. At one point, Linda walked over and tried to include her in the conversation. "You should try some of David's lemonade, it's really good," she said cheerfully. Mrs. Wilson forced a smile. "Maybe later," she replied coldly. Then she turned and left early, muttering under her breath. That night she couldn't sleep. The more she thought about it, the more she felt her position slipping away. It wasn't just about David anymore, it was about her identity. She had built her reputation around being the one who protected the community. But now it seemed the community didn't need her protection anymore. Meanwhile, David kept living his life quietly. He was working from home most days, fixing small things around the house and trying to settle into his new normal. He even started volunteering at a nearby youth center, something he'd always wanted to do but never had the time for before. He rarely thought about Mrs. Wilson now. She was just part of the background noise of neighborhood life, but little did he know she was still watching him, still waiting for a mistake. One afternoon while he was away, she noticed a delivery truck parked outside his house. The driver unloaded several boxes and placed them on his porch. From the street, she could only see the labels. Home renovation supplies. Her mind immediately jumped to conclusions. Without verifying anything, she drafted another complaint email to the HOA, claiming he was starting unauthorized renovations. By the time David returned home that evening, she had already sent 2 follow-up messages. The next morning, he received a notice from the HOA office again, requesting clarification. He laughed softly when he read it. The boxes were just replacement tiles for his bathroom, identical to the ones already installed. He sent photos and receipts once more, and the HOA confirmed everything was fine. But this time, they added something else at the end of the message. Please note, repeated false complaints from any member will result in disciplinary review. Mrs. Wilson received that warning a few days later. It was the first time anyone had ever questioned her authority in an official capacity. She felt insulted, betrayed, even humiliated. That evening, she sat alone in her living room, staring at her framed HOA certificate on the wall. Her husband, quiet as always, asked gently, "Maybe it's time to let this go?" She didn't answer. She just stared at the window, watching the streetlights flicker. The next morning, she made a decision. She wasn't going to stop, not yet. If the HOA wouldn't take her side, she'd find another way. She began looking through public property records, determined to uncover something she could use against him. But the deeper she dug, the more truth she uncovered, and none of it worked in her favor. The documents clearly showed David's full ownership, his clean record, and his legitimate purchase. Still, she refused to accept it. There has to be something, she whispered to herself. While she was busy trying to find fault, David continued to gain the community's respect. He helped organize a small charity car wash for the local school, brought everyone together for a cleanup drive, and even repaired a broken bench in the park. Little by little, his actions built trust. People who once kept their distance now called him a friend, and for the first time Mrs. Wilson noticed something she couldn't control: the way the neighborhood had shifted around her. People no longer asked her for approvals or advice. They began turning to David instead, asking his opinion, inviting him to gatherings, and thanking him for his kindness. One day, she saw a group of kids playing basketball on the street. They waved at David as he walked by, cheering his name. She watched from her porch, feeling invisible in a place where she had once been the center of attention. That evening, she sat outside, sipping her tea. When David passed by on his evening walk, he smiled and said, "Good night, Mrs. Wilson." She didn't respond this time. She just watched him walk away, his calm presence reminding her of everything she had lost, not because of him, but because of herself. In her heart, she knew she had gone too far. But pride has a way of blinding people. Instead of apologizing, she held onto her bitterness, not realizing that the next twist in their story would completely change both their lives, forever. The truth she had tried so hard to avoid was quietly waiting for her, hidden, in the very papers she had once ignored. When the HOA meeting ended that evening, silence filled the room. Nobody knew what to say. The woman who had been so loud and proud minutes ago now sat quietly, staring at the floor. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and for the first time, her confident voice was gone. Everyone could see the embarrassment written all over her face. David stood near the table, holding the property papers that clearly showed his name as the owner. His expression was calm. He didn't gloat or raise his voice. He just wanted to set the record straight. For weeks, this woman had made his life difficult. Letters, warnings, and public accusations. But he wasn't here for revenge. He simply wanted respect. The HOA president, who had recently returned from a trip, finally broke the silence. "I think we owe this man an apology," he said, looking around the room. "It seems there's been a serious misunderstanding and some overstepping of authority." A few people nodded. Some looked down, uncomfortable. No one dared meet David's eyes. The same people who had whispered about him behind closed doors now seemed ashamed. Mrs. Wilson, still in her seat, finally spoke in a trembling voice. "I was only trying to protect the community," she said quietly. "I didn't mean any harm." David turned to her and replied softly, "I believe rules are important, but respect is more important. You could have asked me directly instead of assuming I didn't belong here." She said nothing. Her face turned red as the HOA president cleared his throat and said, "We'll correct all of this immediately, Mr. David. We truly apologize for how you've been treated." David nodded, accepting the apology, but he didn't smile. The damage had already been done, and he wasn't sure if he could ever forget how it felt to be treated like an outsider in a place that was supposed to be home. As he left the room, the neighbors' eyes followed him. A few tried to smile or wave, but he just gave a small nod and walked out into the cool evening air. The streetlights flickered, and he could hear the soft rustling of leaves. For the first time in weeks, he felt a small sense of peace. The next morning, word spread quickly around the neighborhood. People who had once kept their distance now tried to make small talk. Someone brought him a pie. Another left a note that said, "Welcome to the neighborhood." He appreciated the gestures, but deep down, he knew these were attempts to ease guilt rather than genuine friendship. He didn't hold it against them. He understood that sometimes people needed a wake-up call to see how wrong their assumptions could be. Days passed and Mrs. Wilson became strangely quiet. She no longer walked around the neighborhood with her clipboard. Her usual morning rounds stopped. Her voice, which once echoed through the streets whenever she caught someone breaking the rules, was no longer heard. It seemed she wanted to stay out of sight. Some neighbors whispered that she had been asked to step down from her position as HOA head. Others said she had been reprimanded but refused to resign. Whatever the truth was, her power had clearly faded. David, meanwhile, began focusing on improving his home. He fixed the front fence, planted flowers, and even offered to help the elderly couple next door repaint their porch. Slowly, people began to see who he truly was: kind, patient, and willing to lend a hand. One Saturday, the HOA president himself stopped by. He handed David a letter, an official statement from the association clearing his name from all complaints. It also included a formal apology from the HOA board for the wrongful accusations. "Thank you," David said quietly. "I appreciate that." The president smiled awkwardly. "We should have done better," he admitted. "I'll make sure something like this never happens again." David nodded. "That's all I want." As time went on, the mood of the community began to change. People were friendlier, the gossip stopped, and a few of the younger families even invited David to their weekend barbecues. He didn't attend all of them, but when he did, he was received warmly. The same neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now laughed and talked with him easily. Even the children liked him. They'd wave at him when he came home from work, sometimes running up to pet his dog. The street that once felt cold and unwelcoming now carried a different energy, lighter, warmer. But one person still avoided him completely: Mrs. Wilson. She never looked his way. Whenever she saw him outside, she turned and went back into her house. Her pride had taken a deep hit, and she couldn't bring herself to face the man she had wronged. David didn't hate her. In fact, he almost felt sorry for her. He could tell she was struggling with her own shame. Sometimes he'd see her through the window, sitting alone at her dining table, staring out as if lost in thought. A few months later, at another HOA meeting, David was surprised when the HOA president nominated him to join the committee. "You've shown more patience and integrity than anyone I've seen," he said. "We could use someone like you." David hesitated but eventually agreed. He didn't want to lead. He just wanted to make sure no one else went through what he had. His first few meetings were smooth. He suggested small improvements like community events and maintenance schedules. People appreciated his calm voice and thoughtful ideas. Even those who had once believed Mrs. Wilson's accusations began to respect him. Still, Mrs. Wilson never attended the meetings again. Word spread that she had been facing personal issues. Some said she was falling behind on her mortgage payments. Others said her husband had left town for work and might not come back. David didn't pay attention to the gossip. He stayed focused on doing what was right for the community. Then one afternoon, while walking his dog, he saw a "for sale" sign in Mrs. Wilson's front yard. Her beautiful house, the one she'd once used as a symbol of authority, was up for sale. A few days later, a moving truck appeared outside. Boxes were stacked neatly on the porch. David saw her standing there directing the movers. She looked tired, her usual confident air completely gone. For a long moment he thought about walking over to say something. Maybe offer help, maybe wish her well. But he decided against it. Some lessons, he thought, are better learned in silence. A few weeks after she moved out, David got a call from his realtor. "There's a property available next door," she said. "I think you'll want to see it," he laughed softly. "Next door?" "Yes," she replied. "The one that just got listed." He didn't have to ask which one. When he saw the paperwork, he realized it was Mrs. Wilson's old house. It was being sold at a good price because of the seller's financial issues. David thought for a long time before making a decision. Then quietly he bought it. He didn't buy it to make a statement. He bought it because it was a solid investment, and maybe, in a strange way, it brought closure to everything that had happened. When the sale went through, the realtor called Mrs. Wilson to inform her. David wasn't there, but later, he imagined the look on her face when she found out who the new owner was. That evening, as he stood on his porch looking across the street, he felt something shift inside him. Not pride, not revenge, just peace. He had gone through judgment, humiliation, and false accusations, but he never lost his calm or kindness. Now, without saying a single harsh word, he had come full circle. In a community that once doubted him, he now owned 2 homes, and the respect of nearly everyone around him. People often think power comes from shouting the loudest, but David proved that real strength comes from patience and character. Sometimes the quietest person in the room ends up teaching the loudest one the biggest lesson. And in this neighborhood, that lesson would be remembered for years to come. After everything that had happened, the neighborhood seemed to settle into a quiet peace. The air felt different, softer somehow. The same streets that once buzzed with gossip and suspicion now carried laughter and neighborly chatter. People waved at each other, kids played outside, and every morning the air was filled with the smell of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. David had become a familiar face. Not as the new guy, but as someone the community trusted. He wasn't loud or flashy, just calm, dependable, and kind. Over time, his steady presence helped the neighborhood heal from the tension that once divided it. He kept to his daily routine, morning walks with his dog, watering his plants, and helping whoever needed a hand. One weekend, he organized a small community cleanup. Dozens of people showed up with gloves and trash bags, laughing and talking as they worked together. When they were done, the street looked beautiful, not just clean, but alive. The HOA president thanked David publicly, saying, "This place feels like a real community again, and it's because of you." David smiled humbly and said, "It's because of all of us. We just needed to remember we're neighbors, not strangers." His words struck a chord. Everyone clapped, and for the first time in a long time there was a genuine sense of unity. Months passed, and David continued to quietly improve the neighborhood. He repaired fences, repainted curbs, and even helped start a small community garden near the park. The same people who once looked at him with doubt now came to him for advice. Life was peaceful, until one unexpected afternoon. A familiar figure appeared on the street. It was Mrs. Wilson. She was driving an old car packed with boxes. Her once neat hair was now messy, and she looked exhausted. When she stepped out, her eyes wandered around the street, landing on the house that used to be hers, the one she had sold months ago. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at it as if she couldn't believe it was no longer hers. Then her eyes drifted to David's home right next door. Their gazes met for the first time since that meeting. She hesitated but finally walked over, clutching a small folder in her hands. "I need to speak with you," she said quietly. David nodded. "Sure," he replied calmly. "Come in." She stepped inside his house, looking around with surprise. Everything was neat, simple, and warm. There were family photos, books, and the smell of coffee in the air. It didn't look like a stranger's house anymore. It looked like home. "I heard you bought my old place," she said after a long pause. David nodded again. "Yes, it came on the market. It was a good opportunity." Her shoulders slumped. "I guess everything comes full circle," she murmured. "I thought I'd live there forever, but life doesn't always go as planned." David didn't interrupt. He could tell she wasn't just talking about the house. She was talking about her pride, her mistakes, and everything that had come after. After a moment, she said softly, "I wanted to say I'm sorry. I know that doesn't erase what I did, but I've had a lot of time to think. I was wrong. I judged you before I even knew you. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood, but really, I was protecting my own ego." David looked at her, seeing not the strict, bossy woman who once controlled everyone's lives, but a person who had finally faced her own reflection. "I appreciate you saying that," he said quietly. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong." She gave a faint, tired smile. "You have every right to hate me. I don't hate you, he said. Hate doesn't solve anything. We all make mistakes. The real question is what we learn from them. She nodded slowly. For a long moment, they both sat in silence, the sound of the clock ticking softly in the background. Finally, Mrs. Wilson stood up and said, I'm leaving town. I just wanted to make peace before I go. David walked her to the door. Before she stepped outside, she turned and said, I hope this place treats you better than it treated me. He smiled gently. It already has. She gave one last nod, then walked away, her car disappearing down the street. As David stood there watching, he didn't feel triumph or satisfaction. He just felt closure, quiet and complete. The story that had started with suspicion and anger had ended with understanding. A few weeks later, the neighborhood held another gathering, a summer block party. Kids ran around with balloons, music played, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. David stood by the grill laughing with a few of the neighbors,